Hey everyone! You probably know that moving the knight to the edge of the board is very often a bad idea. So in today's video we're going to see some positions to illustrate this idea, but we're also going to see some exceptional cases where moving the knight to the edge of the board can be justified and even a good idea. So we're gonna start with simple positions and we're gonna move on to more complicated ones. So let's start with this one. After e4, d6, we get a pierced defense, and after d4, if black wants to develop the knight to g8, first of all moving the knight to h6 doesn't make a lot of sense. The knight is quite passive there, so knight to f6 makes a lot more sense, putting pressure on e4, and after a move like knight to c3, g6 is a very common idea in this opening, and after knight to f3, now the knight on f6 is greatly placed, developing towards the center, putting pressure on e4, so here a move like knight to h5 again wouldn't make sense, moving the knight to the edge of the board. The knight is controlling f4 but not doing a lot more. For example, here white could continue developing with bishop to e2, or if black wants to justify this idea with the move f5, this would simply expose the king. Here white could even ignore this and castle. White already has a development advantage, or even try to punish black straight away with a move like knight to g5, attacking the knight on h5. So that case seems really clear. But let's imagine that we have this similar position and now white goes bishop to f4, developing the bishop. Here the move knight to h5 at least would attack the bishop. So white has to do something about it, either defend it or move it. But actually here white can simply move the bishop to e3, and the bishop is still very active there. And again the knight on h5 is now misplaced. It was a lot better on f6, where it was putting pressure against the very strong pawn on e4. So this idea of moving the knight to attack a bishop is actually very common. I see it in a lot of my students. And although it might be tempting to attack a piece, it can very often leave us with a very bad position. So let's see another situation where we can get something very similar in another opening. After e4, e5, knight to f3 and knight to c6, we get the Italian game. After bishop to c4, here black would play bishop to c5, and after a move like knight to c3 and knight to f6, here white might be tempted to attack the bishop on c5, which is putting pressure on f2, so the move knight to a4 could be considered. Again we attack the bishop, although in this case there is a tactical problem because black would actually consider taking the pawn on e4. If it wasn't for that case, one might have an idea, which is to trade this knight for this bishop, and black should be a bit careful about where to move the bishop. For example, bishop on d6 looks a bit clumsy. Black will not have the option of moving the d-pawn, and the bishop on d6 is actually quite passive. If bishop to b4, white could consider c3, attacking the bishop, but even here, besides taking on e4, the move bishop to e7 looks very reasonable for black, and now the knight on a4 is actually quite misplaced. Now let's move on to another opening where we could have a knight on the edge of the board. After d4, knight to f6, knight to f3, g6 and bishop to f4, we get a London setup. After bishop to g7 and e3, and after black castles, bishop to e2, d6, castle. In this position here black has tried the move knight to h5. Again in this case it is more justified because we are attacking the bishop on f4. So black wants to trade the knight for the bishop and try to even fight for an advantage with the bishop pair. Having said that, a move like c3 could be considered here, but white normally goes bishop to g5 in this position, and here black has to follow up, otherwise the knight on h5 doesn't make a lot of sense, and the idea is to go h6 and after bishop to h4 go g5. Black has to calculate when going for these lines, because here after knight takes, black has to consider that the knight on h5 would be hanging, but black can take on g5 and also attack the bishop on h4. So here after g5, the idea is that if white goes bishop to g3, black could take the bishop on g3, or even go f5, expanding on the king side. At least the move knight to h5 now makes some sense because the f-pawn can move. But even here, black also has to consider the idea to counter-attack the knight after a move like knight f to d2, which is very often played in this position. And the idea is that if black takes the bishop, white will take on h5. Now black got the two bishops, but white's pawn structure is better. So very often here, black goes knight to f6, and after bishop to g3, the game continues. For example, knight to c6 could be played here. So overall, the move knight to h5 is complicated, playable, but I think that it's a lot simpler to simply develop here as black. For example, go knight to c6 or even knight b to d7. This bishop could also fianchetto. So these are definitely more natural alternatives than the move knight to h5. Now let's take a look at this very instructive position where moving the knight to the edge of the board can be fairly good or fairly bad. So here white played the move knight to a4. The bishop on c5 is actually quite annoying, it doesn't allow white to castle, so white went knight to a4, trying to go for the bishop. If black had a move like bishop to a7, for example with a pawn on a6, this would be a very bad idea for white. So let me show you a similar position with a pawn a6. After the move knight to a4, the bishop can simply retreat, still annoying white, and now black even has a big threat of b5, forking the knight and the bishop. So that's why we need to be very careful when we go for this knight's move on the edge of the board. But here the move knight to a4 is actually justified because white is managing to trade the knight for the bishop. Having said that, after bishop to b6 and knight takes, the game goes on. This was probably the best alternative for black. The idea is that after bishop to b4, white will go c3 and still manage to trade the knight for the bishop. After something like bishop to a5, b4 and bishop to b6, white can trade the knight for the bishop. So bishop to b6 was the simplest and probably the best try for black. Here black took on f4, which is a move that I don't like a lot, because after knight takes, d takes and bishop takes, white simply develops the bishop. Although in this position, black should have continued the game, simply castle. Here instead black went for the move knight to h5, which seems like a very similar idea to the move knight to a4, but this is actually a very bad move. The knight is going away from the center, and very importantly, black is not managing to trade the knight for the bishop. White simply went bishop to e3, attacking the pawn on c5, and now the knight on h5 is going to be misplaced. So this is a position where white already has a very clear advantage with the two bishops, a better center, and a better pawn structure. And before I move on to the next position, if you want to seriously improve at chess, I have a free course that will provide you with a training plan for that, so feel free to check the link in the description. Now let me show you another opening where developing the knight to the edge of the board can be justified. So here after the move d4, knight to f6, c4, e6, knight to f3 and c5, we get the Benoni defense after d5. And here the most common way for black to go is to fianchetto the bishop after knight to f3, g6 and e4, bishop to g7, bishop to e2. White has other options, black as well, but I want to show you the main ideas. After both sides castle, rook to e8, knight to d2, defends the pawn on e4. And here black has three main options to go. One of them is to go a6, planning b5. This is a very common idea in the Benoni, trying to go for space on the queen side. And here white normally goes a4. Another idea is to develop the knight to d7 and then bring a knight to e5. But another very interesting idea for black here is to go knight to a6. And although the knight goes to the edge of the board, it has some very concrete ideas. For example, if white goes a4, this would weaken the b4 square, so knight to b4 might be an idea. The knight is gonna be stable there. Or if white plays something like f3, which is very common, to protect the pawn on e4, now the knight on d2 can move to another square. Here the idea is to bring the knight to c7. So here black is just temporarily bringing the knight to the edge of the board, just to reroute it to a better square. The knight on c7 is supporting some b5 ideas, so it is not necessarily badly placed there. So after something like a4, here black could go b6, and the knight on c7 might support bishop to a6 ideas, or black could also try rook to b8, a6 and b4, and the knight is supporting this advance. Now let me show you another opening where we can get a knight going to the edge of the board. In the Scotch game, after e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, d4, takes and takes, knight to f6 and knight to c3. Here bishop to b4 is very commonly played, putting pressure on e4, and after knight takes, b takes, bishop to d3 and d5, white takes on d5, black takes, both sides castle, bishop to g5 and c6. This is one line that we might get in the Scotch or the 4 knights game. In this position white has a few ideas. Queen to f3 is very common, but here white has also tried the move knight to a4. White could go for a similar idea with the move knight to e2, although there are some pros and cons with the knight on e2 because this would block the queen. Knight to e2 is also playable, but knight to a4 has also been tried a lot, and the idea is to go c4. The knight on c3 was kind of hidden against a wall with these two pawns on c6 and d5, so now white wants to go c4 after something like h6, bishop to h4 and rook to e8. c4 will try to undermine these pawns. So if black takes on c4 after bishop takes, black gets this isolated pawn on c6, that could be a target. Black normally doesn't take, so after bishop to d6, here white can sooner or later take on d5, and after c takes, now the knight normally goes back. So this idea of moving the knight to the edge of the board was also temporary, because now the knight goes back to c3, and now it is putting more pressure on d5. So remember, when in doubt, don't move a knight to the edge of the board, but at least now you know when this idea makes a lot more sense. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.